Oh, we got another one, by the way.
Seriously? I warned you about bringing in strays. This is why I'm moving.
You're moving? I thought we was moving together. Hey, you can't stick me with this rent by myself. I'm still paying off that pet store bill.
Can I help you?
I am Sir Edward Elgar, 1st Baronet Elgar. At your service, sir.
And you are here because...
I am given to understand that you house previously dead composers, shall we say. I couldn't help but overhear that you're moving to someplace, well, bigger than this. Bread box, one would hope.
Well, yes, I am. I'm tired of you freeloaders. At least Morton over there got a job at the 7-Eleven.
I am more than willing to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. I was self-taught. Can you say the same thing about yourself?
No, I'm doing a PhD.
You're incurring the cost of moving on some meager taxpayer-funded stipend. Have you neither shame nor balanced checkbook?
Oh, no, I mean, I live within my means. Also, they help a little bit.
I'm sorry for not following, but who is they?
Just make a video about him. It's the only chance you got of him ever going away. Oh yeah, that strategy worked out just so splendidly for you. Fine. Alright. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Sir Edward Elgar.
Edward Elgar was born in June 1857 in the part of England best known for giving us the name of an unpronounceable sauce. His father, William, owned and operated a music shop. Edward never got a composition lesson from anyone, but he was surrounded by the trade. He accompanied his dad on house calls for piano tuning. He played through figured bass from some older books, which informed his improvisations at the keyboard. The local cathedral was the hub of all Worcester music, and since it was the Elgar shop who provided its musical resources, the cathedral opened its music library to Edward. There he learned to study scores. He first started writing music around 5, started composing more in earnest around age 10, and his first surviving complete composition was a song he wrote when he was 14. It's easy to think of Elgar as an English composer, but he was also a Catholic composer. Being Catholic in England, especially then, was pretty fraught, violence on sectarian lines being a major theme on the British Isles for centuries. William had been hired to play the organ at St. George's Roman Catholic Church, despite a personal resistance to Catholicism. Ironically, it was William's employment that prompted his wife Anne's conversion to Catholicism. So Edward was brought up Catholic despite his father's wishes, and began subbing in for him as early as 1872. William was miserable in this job, so while he initially didn't support his kid learning the instrument's ropes, he was happy to have his services because he liked going out for a drink during the sermons. Edward would succeed his father officially in 1885, whereupon he complained about the quality of the choir and predicted that he would quit within a month. Elgar's early life is full of eclectic music making. He taught himself the bassoon, for some reason, and formed a wind quintet, but it wasn't a standard wind quintet, because they didn't have a horn, they had an extra flute, and they had a clarinetist who kinda sucked, and it wasn't like there was anything written for that grouping. So Elgar first arranged and then wrote original music, which expanded the repertoire, sure, but also gave him practice in writing on a longer scale. Doing that sort of thing was pretty representative of the young Elgar's compositional career. He was often thrown into these situations where he would have to provide music for janky, lopsided amateur ensembles that had no repertoire. That's how he exercised his orchestration muscles. If you can make a piece work for whatever players are handy, then writing for orchestra isn't quite as daunting anymore. It's like musical weight training. He went on to develop his ear for the orchestra alongside his composition chops, such that composition and orchestration were not consecutive processes, but interwoven, allowing him to orchestrate faster than average. This initial large ensemble training came in the form of directing a group of doctors of the local, I can't believe I'm saying this, lunatic asylum, where he had a small base salary incentivized by a small amount per piece composed. Despite growing up on the piano, he had a lower opinion of that instrument than many of his colleagues. The piano has its limitations. When you hit a key, the sound fades away, and then there's nothing more that you can do with it. The organ was better in that capacity when it came to sustaining tones, but was still limited in the number of timbres available at any given moment. The orchestra was the instrument that he'd been searching for, and Worcester was part of the Three Choirs Festival, a yearly rotating banding together of choirs from the rural areas of Western England. And in September 1866, it was Worcester's turn again. The singing was nice, but didn't have that timbral variety Elgar craved. It was the orchestra that fascinated him. So, though he was competent at the keyboard, he didn't think in terms of a keyboard when he composed. Other composers would sketch large ensemble works in short score, then go over it and orchestrate everything. Elgar felt that you couldn't have a truly musical idea without having an idea of timbre. That didn't mean he wrote directly onto the large score, though. In 1869, when the three choirs returned to Worcester, the elder Elgar's shop was tasked with providing the parts to Handel's Messiah, and Edward thought this was going to be his big chance to have some of his music performed. So he covertly inserted some of his own music into Handel's timeless classic, and apparently it went over well, with everyone except his dad. Edward set in on rehearsals and there fell in love with the violin. He proceeded to pick it up and resolved to learn what he had heard by ear. Much as Aaron Copland would come to write an American brand of music despite his personal identity as an outsider, so too with Elgar and English music. His lack of formal training and Catholic faith set him apart from mainstream English culture and music making. As regards the former, it's not like Elgar took special pride in having not gotten training. It was something of a sore spot, actually. In early 1873, the plan was for Elgar to go off to study at the Leipzig Conservatory, but William didn't approve of this plan, and it's not like they had the money to send him off to Germany at any rate. And it's not like there was a place to get training locally. The Royal College of Music was only founded in 1882, many years after the Royal Academy of Music, but the Academy focused more on performance than on composition. No, Edward Elgar was to study the law, joining a long list of composers who start down that path before realizing they don't want to sell their soul. He spent the free time he had reading many books, especially those on theology, and doing music, and left the solicitor's office freshly 16 to launch full-time into music. Great Britain was known as the land without music, which is just a huge misnomer. The term came from Germany around the turn of the century, articulating their perception of the English. Since the death of Henry Purcell, England wasn't known for much in the way of instrumental music or anything that got international attention. But it wasn't without music. Their musical life was just insular and specialized in choral music. To Elgar, England followed, never led. The why is beyond our scope today, but suffice to say that a crown jewel of their very real musical life was the Three Choirs Festival. Musical tastes in the Three Choirs area was perhaps higher than most provincial places, but it's telling about the general attitude that Robert Schumann, over 20 years after his death, was still seen as something of a radical modernist. Elgar saw a kindred spirit in Schumann, whom he called my ideal. He was another composer with an abortive legal career, whose music is defined by sequences, obsessive figurations, and novel harmonic turns that many heard as evidence of composition purely by feeling. Schumann's orchestrations, long considered his weak point as a composer, were a good model for how to write for provincial English orchestras, because both composers had to write for some not super great ensembles. And by extension, they beefed up every line. It's England, so maybe I should say that Elgar roast beefed up every line. The difference is that Elgar spent his formative years writing and arranging music for even worse ensembles than Schumann, so he had a toolkit to mend this hole that Schumann just didn't have. Elgar theorized that Schumann over-relied on the pedal while composing at the piano, a practice Elgar did not share, and discouraged young composers from following. And in Brahms, once mentored by Schumann, Elgar took comfort at his slow pace of development. Brahms was a towering figure of the Teutonic tradition, and yet, at the time, was only on his third symphony of 4, whose English premiere Elgar attended. Elgar's working-class background made for uneasy relationships. His class background, he said, ruined him, making his life impossible until he made a name for himself. Too often he'd heard that his presence here or there was uncouth because his father was a shopkeeper, and his talents as a composer questioned because he was just a violinist. Growing up in an environment tainted by classism changes a person. He never lost his regional accent, forever marking him as someone not cosmopolitan. His second engagement, the one that stuck, was to Alice Roberts, whose father and uncle were both generals and whose great-grandfather invented the Sunday school. When her aunt heard that she was engaged to a tradesman in his early 30s who hadn't done all that much of anything up until that point, she went and wrote Alice out of her will.
Sure, they taught that sort of behavior in Sunday school.
Since Alice was a good bit older than Edward, and their social classes had nothing in common, you can kind of see maybe a little tiny bit where the idea of him being what we might call a gold digger came from. Add onto this her family's devout Anglicanism, and you didn't get Anne Elgar on your side either. But Alice was okay with the Catholic ceremony, and they married in May 1889 in London in front of almost no one, just to get away from all the drama. She would, down the line, eventually convert to Catholicism. Elgar always had a strange relationship with a big city. London was doubtless a center of musical and cultural life in England, and in the summer of 1877, Elgar had saved enough money to have a handful of lessons there with a violinist named Adolf Politzer, who recognized the potential of this provincial kid who had to live off of nuts to make his travel budget work. And he suggested that Elgar stay in the capital and try to make a performing career of it. But Elgar said no. His home, by contrast, had the sort of people in it that mistook his bassoon for a shotgun. The next year, he'd gone back to Politzer, who asked him about his compositions and introduced him to August Manz, conductor of the Crystal Palace concerts, the hub of new and or unfamiliar music in the whole country. They played pieces like Berlioz's Lelio, the direct-to-video sequel to his much more famous Symphonie Fantastique, which prompted Elgar to track down a copy of Berlioz's Treatise on Instrumentation. To get to Crystal Palace concerts, it had once been a whole-day, 120-mile trip, but now the newlyweds settled not far from the Crystal Palace, and Elgar genuinely believed this was the start of great things for his musical career. Much of Elgar's work up until this point was A, only slowly in fits and starts, gaining the aspects of what we think of as the Elgar sound with its plagal progressions and sequences, and B, were what we might call occasional pieces, written for specific ensembles or performances in mind, and not having much of a life on their own after that, something he complained about. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's the vast majority of pieces ever written, but it wasn't going to put his name on the map. This began to turn around in 1890, when the Three Choirs Festival returned to Worcester, and Elgar was commissioned to write an orchestral piece for the very orchestra that had so enthralled him so many years ago. The resulting piece, the beginning of his compositional maturity, one could argue, was Froissart. Elgar had, as typical for him, mixed feelings about this piece, and he had to give up copyright to have it published. Though the piece was well received, his career in London wasn't advancing fast enough to support himself, Alice, and their baby girl, Caris Irene, who entered the world in August 1890. As much as it pained him, he had to go back to Worcestershire, tail between his legs, to give violin lessons. Others could see just how much he felt this was beneath his level as a musician and as a creative artist. Though he had too much pride, too stiff an upper lip, really, as nonsensical as that idiom is, to outright say it to anyone. He made it a point never to speak about how he really made his living teaching and playing the violin, if he could help it. His pupils caught on to the fact he didn't like doing this. He once said that teaching was like turning a grindstone with a dislocated shoulder. Edward, that is suspiciously specific.
You should have seen the caliber of children I had to teach.
He wasn't a good teacher of the kinds of kids that he taught, because he had no time for patience or fun when trying to teach a 9-year-old, even the 9-year-olds who would turn out to be pretty good under others' tutelage. When he was having a good time composing, he would just sort of be off in the corner working on his piece during lessons. For Elgar, the monetary value of his music was not about making ends meet. Solvency was not the core issue. It was that Elgar believed his music's worth was not dictated by the labor he put into it, but by what people were willing to pay for it. Talk was cheap. 100 nice reviews meant nothing but for a few negative ones. Cold hard cash was a metric to which Elgar could point and be reassured that his music was found to be valuable. That price and value were, in an Edmund Burkean sense, kind of the same thing. Until he was in his 40s, his money in music mostly came from teaching and not composing. That's the reality for most composers today, and one that I'm perfectly fine with, but back then it was more realistic to make a career of it purely on the back of your own work. Elgar once wrote that he was on the verge of a total career change when his fortunes finally shifted. He was prone to second-guessing himself and needed outside encouragement and stimulus to keep going in his career when things looked like they'd stalled out. When he got a commission and the jubilation of having gotten a commission wore off, it was up to those close to him to tell him he was the only guy for the job, that he had to do it. So getting compositions finished was something of a collaborative effort, even if all the creative work was his own. Much of this encouragement came from Alice. Something that I kept thinking while I was researching this video was how much Alice Elgar sacrificed. She married a man so notably younger than herself that everybody seemed to go out of their way to comment on that, and his lower social status meant not only tensions within her family, but a continual giving up of her material wealth, from selling property to pawning jewelry to support a man who was, at the time she married him, definitively not succeeding at the thing he was trying so desperately to succeed in. There are examples of all kinds of marriages throughout music history, just as all of history, but I can't think offhand of a relationship that comes off quite this lopsided that was still, by all accounts, very content. If he had a score that he had to orchestrate quickly, Alice would stay up while Edward slept to prepare all of the systems, measuring out all the bar lines, doling out key signatures, time signatures, etc., so he could crank out just a few more pages the following day. He could orchestrate faster than anyone, even without this help. In 1901, when a deadline mix-up left organist-composer Herbert Brewer no time to orchestrate his cantata Emmaus, Elgar bailed him out by doing the whole thing in 10 days.
Just for reference, I want that on the record, that is extremely impressive.
Throughout his career, Elgar would reuse ideas and cannibalize older pieces for good material. Sketches for an old forgotten piece could become a theme in a larger work down the road. There are plenty of examples here. I'll mention just one. He'd sketched out parts of a violin sonata in 1887, when he was asked to write a piece to celebrate the visit of the future King George V to Worcester Cathedral, and he turned it into this thickly scored Wagnerian sursum corda for organ, strings, brass, and timpani. The organ takes a prominent role in his earlier instrumental music because he had hands-on experience with the instrument and it was so intimately tied into the choral tradition. His 1895 organ sonata was, in some senses, his biggest work up until his first symphony came about, because it's symphonic in scope, and in fact was orchestrated by Gordon Jacob in 1946 as an Elgar Symphony No. 0 of sorts, although Jacob didn't call it that. He was also scraping himself against deadlines, like constantly, such that rehearsals could be a problem. For the organ sonata, the premiering organist, a guy named Hugh Blair, was given only 4 days to learn a monster score from scratch. Elgar could not blame Blair for the ensuing slapdash performance. He did his best under the circumstances that Elgar had created. I don't want to focus too much attention on Elgar's lack of formal tutelage. He had his favorite techniques, like sudden soft and unexpected out-of-key chords, but it wasn't like he was a dilettante who did what he did because he didn't know better. On the contrary, we have books and treatises on composition techniques filled with notes, and in many cases corrected by Elgar's youthful hand. We can be reassured from the available evidence that he knew just as much as any conservatory-trained composer, if not more. Also, musicologists do this thing where they're trying to find 3 different periods of any major composer, because they did it for Beethoven and nobody stopped them yet. For Elgar, these eras are broadly his apprenticeship to around 1900, his maturity from 1900 to 1914, and then the late period from then until his death in 1934. I don't know how reasonable this is, as there's no consensus on when Elgar reached his mature style, anywhere between King Olaf and the First Symphony, but focusing mainly on the Enigma variations. Elgar's music shows Wagner's influence and how he was interpreted across Europe. His inescapable presence led many Germans to follow his lead, and in France, Debussy helped shape a radically new approach to musical grammar that was the inverse of Wagner's in most every respect. But England didn't have the same sort of beef with Germany that France had. Well, not yet. Elgar's trip to Bayreuth in 1893, where he heard the full ring cycle, was enormously influential, but at no point does Elgar's music sound like Wagner's. Elgar was unafraid of including bits of one movement in another when dealing with multi-movement pieces. But as Matthew Riley points out in his book, Edward Elgar and the Nostalgic Imagination, Elgar doesn't seamlessly weave this in. Instead, something of the musical past is restated and left to hang there. Not in synthesis with its immediate surroundings, but in opposition to them. It's stuff like that, Riley argues, that builds a sense of nostalgia in Elgar's music, or if you prefer more poetic terms, ghostliness, an early epithet for his late piano quintet. While most tonal composers go 1-5-1 in long-term progressions, Elgar consistently chose 1-4-1, the plagal cadence, stereotypical of church music and the most easily recognizable way in which he preferred flats to sharps. The Wagner influence came to a head in King Olaf, a cantata that first established Elgar's national reputation. This adaptation of Longfellow's poem about the introduction of Christianity to Norway uses the full Wagnerian gamut of techniques, from leitmotifs, how to handle sequences and phrases, all of which kept the drama moving forward. The success of King Olaf led to other opportunities and performances in London, and one can understand Elgar's desire to make it in the big city. But he was such a beloved figure in Worcester that in an effort to keep him there, musicians banded together in 1898 to form the Worcester Philharmonic. Elgar was a gifted and prolific melodist. He was also able to pack a large number of ideas into a single piece. If one of my composition students had as many ideas in their music as Elgar often has in his, I'd probably tell him to reserve a few for the next piece. Some have hinted that his exposure to Wagner and his Und innerliche Melodie was his inspiration for this. I rather think that he was already a very melodic composer, whose trips to hear Wagner showed him just what was possible within his own language. He perfectly matched Wagner's concept of an unending melody with the posh English sensibility that a man with a mustache like that just exudes. We've had a lot of really bad facial hair on the show recently, so just a shout out to Elgar's stash. This is top-notch stuff.
I'm terribly sorry. Exudes? Exudes what exactly, young man? Is my facial hair some kind of ignominious pustule to you? Pfft. Americans.
Elgar was fond of sequential melodies, and it's kind of a clever observation that his melodies often resemble the physical geography of Malvern Hills. This was Elgar's proverbial backyard, and the rolling geography is a metaphor for the way that Elgar's melodies unfold. William Walton once joked that Edward wrote the first phrase and then went for a walk as Alice completed the descending sequences. His music features an aversion to thinking in 4 parts. This is probably the most direct evidence of how he learned music. It also avoids a sense of finality in a lot of his phrases by, in part, avoiding root position triads. Yet as long and irregular and sequential as his phrases can be, they never sound amateurish or poorly constructed. The melodies began life as these short phrases which grew organically from their source. His analogy was that various forms of a phrase came out of the same oven, and then he chose the best one in context from that fluctuating mass of material. Hey, you're right here giving me crap about exudes, and you're talking about fluctuating masses?
I don't know what upsets you so much about the way I word things.
This kind of sketching wouldn't just be in his head, though. He would write up to a dozen variants on any 1, 2, 3 given measures, because it was as important for it to be right to the eye as it was to the ear. As he matured, he was able to write these little scraps of music here and there, all different versions completely out of order from the final piece. Exhausting for the musicologist trying to complete an unfinished work, but a great working method for assuring an intricate web of relationships across a piece's total runtime. Only once he had enough variations on the material did he use the piano as a way to check himself and try out different versions of things, and once he knew what material he liked, he would take his stack of papers and put them all up around the room on any available surface to trace the music and assemble its final form like an escape room meets a jigsaw puzzle. You know, one of the great joys of reading about so many different composers is to learn about their working methods and how they wrote their music and compare it to my own. And after learning all about how Elgar did his thing, I just want to take a nap. Like, that whole process sounds exhausting. He was musically as well as politically conservative, saying how modern composers, i.e. those younger than him, were blending keys in a vulgar way. But he was not alone in his suggestion that microtonality would be the way forward, a subtle refinement, as he called it, which would then educate the ear. He even wrote songs which feature parts written in 2 different keys. The central piece of Elgar's life, and the piece on which most of his modern reputation is staked, is his 1899 variations on the original theme, known as the Enigma variations. The Enigma theme is varied 14 times to represent Elgar's friends. His friends and family were just happy to see him writing both happily and unprompted by a commission. The movement titles themselves are cryptic, another enigmatic layer, but we know who these folks are. The word enigma to describe the theme was an authoritative addition that turned the piece into a puzzle. Elgar said there was also a hidden theme that runs throughout the piece, lurking somewhere but never directly heard. While Elgar only referred to the hidden thing as an it, the consensus is that it's some kind of melody. That is, the opening theme of the Variations is a counter-melody to a dark, unheard, and yet well-known presence. There's a huge list of educated guesses by people who have spent much more time with this piece than I have, and plenty of music works contrapuntally with it to greater or lesser extents. So the enigma refers to something cryptic, but it's not the hidden it. The main theme itself is the enigma. Compared to its variations, these clever, evocative depictions of friends and family repeat with their quirks and habits. The enigma is like a meaningless theme, a kind of blank canvas. It was also very much something on its own. This is the odd one out. Jerrold Northrop Moore, whose authoritative and exhaustive biography is a definitive source on all things Elgar, heavily implies that the larger hidden theme, Elgar's it, was not a musical theme, but rather death itself, a constant presence in Elgar's time before the advent of most modern medicines. In a piece about people, death makes sense as an underlying unplayed theme. It comes for us all. But Charles Richard Santa and Matthew Santa contend that Elgar encoded pi, like the mathematical constant, 3.141592653, into the theme, both in the scale degrees of the opening and in these curious downward sevenths. They contend this is Elgar's way of encoding 22/7, a common fractional approximation of pi. I guess as long as we have him here, we might as well ask him. Sir Edward, what was this hidden theme in the Enigma Variations?
Now, you would think that I would have told somebody on my deathbed if it were that important. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe I was just messing with you lot.
No, didn't hurt to ask. The piece was not the only code Elgar left for us, whose meaning he took to his grave. 2 years earlier, Elgar wrote a letter to his friend Dora Penny, now known as the Dorabella cipher, which has remained a complete mystery. Elgar had a lot of unwarranted confidence in Dora to figure out his ciphers, as she never figured it out. He also thought that she had the best shot at guessing the hidden theme in the Enigma Variations. Poor Dora. Actual expert cryptographers can't crack the Dorabella cipher. What chance did she have? Elgar was a little disturbed at how much buzz the mystery had generated. And yet he did it again, later with a cryptic inscription in his 1910 violin concerto, a Spanish quotation about the piece containing the soul of perhaps someone feminine, because he asked someone fluent in Spanish about a potential pronoun, but he left it out of the finished piece, so it's unclear who this might have been. You might wonder if Elgar left any mysteries that we do know the answers to, and I can give you a qualified yes in the form of his Opus 60 songs. These are fake Eastern European tunes with texts written by a Pietro de Alba and composed in Lairish Turasp and dedicated to Yvonne. The author was Elgar himself under the pseudonym of his daughter's Rabbit, and either an anagrammed English parish or German Peter Rabbit as the place. No, we don't know who Yvonne is. It's turning into the worst, lowest stakes, unsolved mysteries episode of all time. Ugh. Also, have you ever seen this as a representation of Bach? Yeah, one source points to this being an Elgar invention, though I can't confirm it. I'm sorry, I just don't have time to go down every research rabbit hole. But maybe Bach would know.
Was denken Sie über mich? Ich habe keine Ahnung. Entschuldigung, ich habe keine Zeit für diesen Unsinn jetzt.
The Enigma theme, slow with empty downbeats, sequential motion, and these curious melodic sevenths, is quintessential nostalgic Elgar. Vaughan Williams put it best when he said that there was something typically English about the piece, as it struck a balance between the new, strange, and original, and the old, familiar, and universal. As Percy M. Young put it in his entry in Elgar Studies, the Enigma Variations is one of the few compositions by an Englishman that is regarded as an essential part of the national heritage. It was an instant success, even more so once Elgar expanded the finale, representing his future self and his aspirations by almost 100 bars. Finally, it seemed, there was an English piece for orchestra that retained its Englishness, it showed its composer at his best, and could go toe-to-toe with any piece on the continent without having a text sung by a chorus along with it. It helped earn its composer an honorary doctorate from Cambridge. Well, they were just handing them out back then, weren't they? What the heck am I trying so hard to earn one?
I haven't the foggiest idea, young man. Hard work and self-study worked well enough for me.
It's actually pretty funny for a different reason. Among the Enigma Variations fans was composer Charles Villiers Stanford, who, after an honorary induction into the Worcestershire Philharmonic, repaid Elgar by pulling strings for the doctorate.
He was a terrible composer, and a self-absorbed dillweed, too. So, I ciphered his name to Satanford instead of Stanford in my dream of Gerontius. What a fun shape.
Hey, don't get ahead of ourselves. We're going to get back to that. We're going to get to the Elgar Stanford beef later, trust me. The Dream of Gerontius is not Elgar's most famous work for four big reasons. One, choral orchestral stuff got prohibitively expensive after World War I. Two, it's overtly Catholic in an Anglican country. Three, it's not the Enigma Variations. And four, its initial failure spooked other choral directors from wanting to do it themselves, believing that it was just too hard. But if Elgar never writes another note of music, Granville Bantock wrote, I will still say that he is a giant and overtops us all. Elgar brought everything to the table, now including text, and a shorter libretto than he used for his earlier pieces in the form, King Olaf and Caractacus, so he didn't have to rely on the text so much to guide the musical structure. With Caractacus, the press already said that he was a musical Rudyard Kipling, but a few skeptical reviews had left Elgar thinking that that piece had been a failure. The text in Gerontius was from Cardinal John Henry Newman's poem of the same name, chronicling an old man's death and his spiritual travel to purgatory. In this piece, Elgar staked his claim as a Catholic composer. While Anglicanism took a lot from Catholicism, one of the key bits that got left behind during the split was purgatory, a state of purification before the faithful can reach heaven. I'm not a theologian, but I'm given to understand that this teaching, while not from the Bible itself, originates from Catholicism's classification of sins into different categories. So if you die believing, but still having some of these sins, you need to get those sorted out.
I'd say that's close enough for rock and roll.
Elgar didn't want this piece to be called an oratorio, which is a little odd because it's dramatic and otherwise fits the bill, and to include the fact that oratorios are kind of a hybrid between the cantata and the opera, and almost always on religious themes. Elgar wrote incidental music for plays, but never wrote an opera, likely for similar reasons for putting off symphonies. It's intimidating. He would go on to write oratorios on biblical themes, as we'll see in a few moments, so maybe modesty, maybe its non-biblical source material prompted the refusal of the genre title for Gerontius. It was influenced by theatrical music, like Wagner's Tristan und Isolde in its structure. Wagner worked in whole acts, Gerontius works in just two halves. On the success of these pieces, Richard Strauss toasted Elgar as England's first progressivist.
But hark! Upon my sense comes a fierce hubbub, which would make me fear. Could I be frightened?
We are now arrived close on the judgment court. That summoned power is for the demons to assemble there. Hungry and wild to claim their property and bear their souls for hell. Is the cry.
How sour and hard, poop of dissonance!
Gerontius premiere was a disaster, foretold by a domino of smaller disasters. The music was late getting to the ensemble because everyone had to work off of one single manuscript. The choir was woefully under-rehearsed. Elgar berated them at the rehearsals, which, as some in the press openly speculated, likely didn't encourage them to do well in the first performance. But even though the premiere was, by all accounts, accidentally bitonal since the whole choir was flat throughout, it was still hailed as a masterpiece, better than the Enigma variations even. It says a lot about the quality of a work when even the world's worst performance can't sabotage it. But Elgar was the kind of guy for whom all the praise in the world was no balm on failure. Through the extensive correspondence we have between Elgar and his publisher, August Jaeger, we see an Elgar both affected personally by unfiltered commentary and often too stubborn to take Jaeger's advice. At least at first. When Elgar did take said advice, I think it improved the pieces. This is not to say that Jaeger was any good as a composer, or that Elgar's instincts were wrong, but credit where credit's due. Jaeger knew music well, and he had an ear for what would be effective. Jaeger was the closest Elgar got to a composition teacher in this sense, and he did what the best of such teachers do. Figure out what someone's trying to say with their music, and then give advice on how best they can go about saying it. There's a lot of surviving correspondence between these two, and after the Gerontius premiere, Elgar wrote,
I have worked hard for 40 years, and at the last, Providence denies me a decent hearing of my work. I always said God was against art, and I still believe it. I have allowed my heart to open once. It is now shut against every religious feeling and every soft, gentle impulse forever.
Bad performances come with the territory, and they can be immensely uncomfortable to sit through as a composer. I speak from personal experience here. But I can't imagine a performance so bad that you lose your faith in God. Of course, there are other Elgar pieces that are quite famous, but they weren't the ones that put him on the map. The biggest piece I've yet to mention is the cello concerto, but that comes much later. The other is the stereotypical graduation music, part of a set of pomp and circumstance marches, which is well known but does nothing musically to earn its standout character. There's nothing particularly Elgarian in this famous passage, most familiar to graduates. Actually, I don't even know if I've heard this outside of like TV show graduation, so hey, comment below if you have actually heard this piece played at a graduation. Like, I'm starting to think this is some kind of conspiracy theory. It's unfair to call England the land without music at any part of its history, but that didn't mean the English weren't very attuned to and embarrassed by that perception. To the extent that it was true, Elgar was the first full flowering of a latter-day English musical renaissance. He began sketching the Enigma variations in October 1898. By 1903, an all-Elgar festival was in the works. Hans Richter, Elgar's champion on the conductor's podium, hoped that the festival would have as its crown jewel a long-awaited First Symphony. Elgar was also knighted in 1904. You could make the case, and at least one newspaper did, that this adulation was only partially deserved. That maybe those in charge of such things felt like they had to make up for this middle-aged composer who, half a decade prior, was practically unknown. Elgar was increasingly comfortable in large forms, but no symphony yet. In 1903, he entered the oratorio space with the first of a planned set of 3, The Apostles, The Kingdom, and The Last Judgment, the last of which he never got around to writing. His focus in the oratorios is not on the familiar Jesus story, but on the men and women around him. Less J, more crew. This is the funniest thing I've said in a long time.
I don't think this chap is funny at all.
Elgar limited himself to scripture for his words, overlaying, interweaving bits and pieces together to comment on the main story. Very unusually for a composer working with long and unwieldy source material, Elgar worked on the text both by himself and as he wrote the music. Usually the libretto is done first, and then the music, 2 separate creative processes, usually 2 separate people. Somehow for Elgar, combining them worked, but only to a point. The dramatic arc of the piece would have to come second to Elgar's abstract musical concerns. I wonder how much this working method kept him from completing the trilogy. There's a lot of factors here. It's a project that could have no singular protagonist, and the story has no clear ending, and financial issues inherent in these big productions factored in, and Maybe he was just burnt out on the motifs and didn't have enough gas in the tank to write music about the end of time, especially as his personal and financial circumstances shifted. The Apostles was praised by Richter as the greatest work of its kind since Beethoven's Mass in D. Very high praise. Elgar was attempting to do an oratorio what Wagner did with opera in the Ring cycle. And as great as the music is, we have to admit he kind of failed on this front because the trilogy was left with only 2 parts. As in The Dream of Gerontius, the prospect of directly depicting the divine was too daunting a task, one that had led to much hemming and hawing between him and Jaeger and Gerontius. The second installment was produced at one of the most difficult periods of his life, delivering these unreasonably controversial lectures in Birmingham and conducting the London Symphony Orchestra not just in his own works, but larger programs, such that hearing The Kingdom, he said, produced no pleasure. The failure to complete the trilogy prompted him finally to work on a symphony. He produced 2 in 1908 and 1911, with a violin concerto wedged in between. He'd had enough European influence to know that writing a symphony was to plant your flag on a very big mountain, and he sided with more conservative composers like Brahms in regarding the unprogrammatic symphony, that is, a piece of music without a story, as the highest form music could take. But he also knew very well the progressive music of composers who blurred tonality and shunned the unprogrammatic symphony, composers like Liszt and his son-in-law Wagner. Maybe because he was self-conscious, he mostly worked with stories, explicit texts, implied narratives, or sketches of friends, despite thinking that doing so made for inferior music. But he also saw a link between symphonic composition and Wagnerian music drama. Elgar's approach to the symphony in his relatively advanced age of 51 when producing his first also invites Brahmsian comparisons, for whom the decades-long gestation of his first symphony was entirely under the long shadow of Beethoven. But Brahms came from a symphonic culture. Had he been Danish or Swedish or Hungarian or even American, Brahms probably would have written more symphonies because he would have probably gotten an earlier start. Elgar had no such excuse other than his need to build up his skills in form of abstract autodidactic lacquer. Purcell died before the symphony came to mean anything like what it meant even to Haydn, let alone Beethoven or Brahms, so the weight of starting an English symphonic tradition lay squarely on Elgar's shoulders. The result, when it finally arrived, was a massively successful piece that, once again, not only consolidated his now formidable national reputation, but offered up another potential avenue of development for a genre which was fast approaching its wilderness years. The symphony wouldn't have been the same without all of the oratorio experience that came before it. The man who scoffed at programmatic music and yet wrote only programmatic music up until that point found in the symphony a fusion of opposites. The questions of what a symphony was and what would happen to it had already been challenged by the German progressives. In Elgar, there was promise for a way forward for the genre. Richter said it was the greatest symphony of modern times, written by the greatest modern composer, and not only in this country. In an era of musical nationalism, where composers turned to the music of their people for inspiration, Elgar did not quote English folk music. "I am folk music," he once said.
I am the Senate.
But Elgar's fame did not last forever. Due to many factors, some of which may be forever consigned to the realm of speculation, Elgar regularly packed halls during his life for a period of maybe 5 years. His 15 minutes of fame was truly up when the premiere of Falstaff at an all-Elgar concert was full of empty seats. Elgar regarded Falstaff as his best piece. Some have suggested the public's ambivalence was due to an analysis that Elgar himself published in the Musical Times, but Jaeger had done similar things for preceding works, and that went over well. Doing that sort of thing didn't make the public think that the piece was just for eggheads. Elgar was, of course, not alone in his choice of inspiration by that particular Shakespearean character, one of the bard's most memorable creations, but his choice to depict him in pure instrumental music was, in comparison to, say, Verdi's opera or later Gustav Holst's at the Boar's Head. Elgar split hairs on terminology to avoid writing program music where he could. Since he believed in absolute music superiority, he called Falstaff a symphonic study instead, adopting a private definition of program music that would coincidentally keep Falstaff from being categorized as such. Yet he admired tone poets like Strauss because he believed Strauss could put out an amazing non-programmatic symphony if he so chose. The second symphony was written far faster than the first, but this sequel flopped. Where the first went from success to success, the second, within 1 week of its premiere, played to houses not even a quarter full. This lends credence to the idea that Elgar was the victim of a passing fad. After so much success, the failure of the Second Symphony, his ailing and departed friends, and the next generation of composers made him as doubtful and as self-critical as ever, even though whether or not audiences came to see his pieces is a completely separate metric from the piece's quality. I think the answer to Elgar's shooting star fame was this. As he grew older, the younger generation caught up. By 1910, Vaughan Williams had burst onto the scene with his Fantasia on a theme of Thomas Tallis and his Sea Symphony, which offered a different route forward for the late Romantic and/or English symphonic work. Elgar's friends one by one began to die, informing his rhapsodic violin concerto to more polarizing reception than the usual praise. More so than with the symphony, the concerto prompted critics to ask if the received forms of these larger pieces were still relevant and useful, if the contemporary composer still had something to say in genres weighed down by historical expectations. To a conservative like Elgar, it was obvious the answer to that question was yes, that tonality and diatonic writing in general ought to be defended against the forces of atonality that were coming to boil on the continent. To me, this criticism says more about the evolution of critics' tastes than with Elgar's music. There were just more English composers from which to choose. Elgar was no longer the only game in town. The overenthusiasm with which the Elgar Festival had been held a half-decade prior was replaced with not enough enthusiasm. The public grappled with no longer being a land without music. Elgar told a musicians' club dinner in 1929 that
the character of English people musically is extremely bad. They do not care for music in the least. They follow a man for a time, and then drop him.
Elgar had great ambition, but deep insecurities, haunted by eye problems, nerve problems, and even suicidal thoughts, which informed his portrayal of Judas in The Apostles. Not a sympathetic portrayal, but certainly a deeply tragic one. Composition left his soul raw, and he suffered depressive bouts during and after writing. He was distracted by the small negatives of larger positives. When he was at one point offered a lifetime blanket contract to guarantee the publication of everything he wrote in perpetuity, Elgar was dejected, because his music didn't sell as well as others, because he didn't work at the piano, and thus his music didn't adapt well for the piano. Sir Edward, you just won £1 million.
£1 million? That's rubbish. I can't accept that. I haven't earned it.
See what I mean? Now, I am in no way qualified to say that Elgar was, say, bipolar or on the autism spectrum, even professionals who can make those diagnoses probably shouldn't when it comes to historical figures. So I'm on my own with my analysis here. And as a result, you should take what I say in this chapter with the appropriate number of grains of salt. But to me, details of Elgar's biography point towards neurodivergence in some way. And I think it's worth highlighting the ways in which he was different because there continues to be stigma against people of Elgar's temperament today. The belief that terms to describe neurodivergence, including the very word neurodivergence itself, are somehow fake or this modern epidemic is as blatantly untrue as it is actively damaging. The only difference is now we have more words to describe the same phenomena. So what are these biographical details that make me think that Elgar might fit onto this spectrum? Well, Elgar sometimes had little regard for social norms or expectations. He spoke his mind, told people off, insulted them, or just said things that annoyed people and didn't realize it, especially in rehearsals. He suffered from misophonia, which turns out is actually more common than most people realize, but it very much affected him. If he heard kids with squeaky shoes on, it would take all his willpower not to scream. Some would see a talkative Elgar, bursting with energy and ideas and pulling pranks with kids. Others would see a man of deep antisocial gloom. On long bike rides with friends, he loved biking and all sorts of exercise. He would often stop halfway through to info dump about his latest pieces. And lastly, he would take up sudden interests in completely new subjects, like the time he got obsessed with chemistry out of nowhere and set up a whole lab in his basement. He then made too much of a certain kind of explosive phosphorus paste, got bored by it in the middle of an extremely dangerous process, so he put what he had in a pot and stuck that pot in his rainwater collection tank, which was atomized soon thereafter while he was orchestrating and totally destroyed his garden. Then he walked outside and talked to his neighbor like nothing at all had happened.
Morning. Oh, I didn't hear anything. What'd you ask?
If World War II hadn't happened, we would still be calling World War I the Great War. And when the sequel has characters like Churchill, Hitler, Patton, Stalin, Mussolini, and FDR running or wheeling around, it can be hard for us to properly put ourselves back into the shoes of Europeans living in July 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and knocked down an avalanche of dominoes that tore the continent apart. At first, belligerents hoped for a swift end to the conflict, but as trench warfare set in and horrors beyond comprehension swept the land, artists began creating responses to the intractable human meat grinder that lay waste to France, Belgium, and so many points beyond. Most of these responses are products of their time. That is, they're more particular to that conflict and less applicable to, say, the horrors of war in general. World War I brought the romanticism birthed by Beethoven and Schubert to a brutal end, knocking down the load-bearing wall that was Germanic music. Elgar had been inspired by different threads of late Romanticism from nations which were now murdering his countrymen en masse. The shift in attitudes affected by the Great War changed England's perception of, by now, an elder statesman of their culture. It can be kind of uncomfortable to listen to Elgar's Edwardian airs of jingoistic patriotism. Those who had seen the front lines, had actually been in those trenches, and made it back, were too scarred by their experience to be proud of their country in the same way, since it was that pride, in part, which had led to the conflict in the first place. The Great War affected the way Elgar's past music was heard, and I think soured a lot of, at the time, younger listeners from paying attention to how Elgar was, indeed, moved and horrified by what was going on, even though he was too old to fight. The spirit of England was one of his responses to the conflict, and yeah, it's a product of its time, but what isn't? The conflict's human toll dovetailed with a flu pandemic that wrecked the world in numbers that put COVID to shame, on top of depleted economies, forced composers to be creative and find smaller, flexible ensembles. There was a lot of experimenting to fit the end of Romanticism. Elgar wasn't about to radically alter his musical style, but he was affected just as much as everyone else, and turned his pen more towards chamber music. But he didn't abandon the orchestra, his favorite instrument. The greatest artistic fallout of World War I, maybe by any composer, was his Cello Concerto, a work with all the intimacy of chamber music in an unusual 4-movement format. He would have these months-long creative dry spells, and often break through them with something brilliant. After the better part of a year of compositional inactivity, Elgar first wrote the theme that he was to enshrine in his Cello Concerto in 1918, but he didn't write the piece itself until May and June of 1919, when the Great War had concluded and legions of shell-shocked men returned to a battered country. As best I can tell, the concerto, though its premiere was also botched, if you can believe that, was the last piece of her husband's that Alice Elgar would ever hear. Many composers suffer from a loss in reputation after their deaths. Elgar is often put into this camp, but the English musical public began to ignore his works within a few years of his first fame. Important premieres went with many empty seats, even before World War I. The cello concerto suffered this fate as well. A focus on simplicity, expression, and balance led Elgar to bear the orchestration down to its essence. And orchestral performers back then had no clue what to do with a concerto with, well, to put it bluntly, so few notes. Meanwhile, the war and the death of Romanticism on the continent assured that Elgar's once close contacts with German musicians fizzled. If he wanted his music out there, he'd have to find a different path. One of Elgar's friends and champions, the conductor and Falstaff dedicatee Landon Ronald, was an early adopter of recording technology, which in those days was crude, cumbersome, and entirely analog, in not the fun kind of way. Songs had to be more or less shouted into a large horn, which would then etch a maximum of 4 minutes onto first wax cylinders, then discs made out of various substances. First shellac and vinyl would come later. These would not pick up soft sounds, but loud sounds were also bad because they would threaten to destroy the recording. For a composer of orchestral music, using this earliest form of recording technology was a recipe for complete failure. In order to get anything across, you had to cut your piece down to size and orchestrate it to be as loud as possible for the fewest instruments possible, so everybody could crowd around the horn and just blast out something that vaguely resembled your original piece. But despite all its inherent shortcomings, recording piqued Elgar's interest. His friends knew he liked science, and recording wasn't likely to blow up half the neighborhood if something went drastically wrong. He was commissioned to write some new short pieces to fulfill a recording contract in late 1913. Plus, despite the honors he collected, Elgar was rarely as financially stable as he would have liked, so even if he had private misgivings, he also needed whatever revenue this newfangled technology would provide. All of which is to say that Elgar got in on the ground floor, understood that this was going to be an important medium for conveying music, and he wasn't perturbed by the severe alterations that he had to make. In November 1920, Beatrice Harrison recorded a version of the cello concerto. But by July 1932, after recording technology had advanced and engineers figured out a way to bar the microphone from the world of radio, probably the earliest important record of classical music on disc was when Yehudi Menuhin played the Elgar Violin Concerto. When new technologies come along, it can be hard to know what's a fad and what's going to stick. How best to utilize those that have staying power. It's easy in our modern shoes to look back on those who lived at the dawn of the recording age and scoff at those who didn't adapt. And hard to recognize the early adopters for the visionaries they often were. Elgar did not live long enough to see the era of high fidelity, but that wasn't the point. He was open to providing a record of his work for posterity in a different form than the score. Coming at Elgar from my perspective, that is to say someone who's been involved in music as an academic pursuit for some time, it's sobering to think that there was a time when someone with only practical hands-on knowledge, who knew music as a tradesman and not as a scholar, could achieve the highest level of musical expression in an entire country. Elgar long held a disdain for academia. In the fall of 1887, he was asked to help a blind musician named William Wolstenholme take the exams necessary for his degree, and was stunned to find out the examiners were too stubborn to admit to a typo on the counterpoint section. Elgar disliked the trappings of the academy so much, he very nearly declined his first honorary doctorate, thinking himself unworthy, he didn't want to be called Dr. Elgar, and so on. The Cambridge honor was not the last he would receive. On the heels of the Elgar Festival in 1904 was a desire to give him a position at Birmingham University. A new chair had been endowed by a man named Richard Peyton on the condition that it be given to Edward Elgar. It put the university in a weird position because they didn't want to set a precedent for the wealthy just being able to install personal favorites in important posts. You can see how that system would be blatantly abused. Elgar either had to accept a job he didn't really want, or decline and leave the institution without a chair.
You could say that without a chair, they'd only have a table.
I know, you're extremely funny. Elgar actually declined the job at first, but then he was pressed to accept on a few conditions. 1, he not be expected to live in Birmingham. 2, he give a maximum of 6 lectures in his first year. 3, he basically not be expected to do any teaching work at all. And 4, the post not be advertised. This is not a university position, Edward.
They agreed, and I got £400 per year, and I took the initiative in setting up their music library. Thank you very much.
Elgar may have been motivated by his beef with Stanford here, though. He turned down a post in Leeds, where Stanford held a lot of sway, and then Elgar invited Strauss, who made Stanford foam at the mouth in anger, to Birmingham in repayment for the kind words that Strauss had said about him. When Elgar did this bare minimum and turned up to deliver lectures on English music, later published as A Future for English Music, he went out of his way to denigrate the Rhapsody as a form, and Stanford's best-known works were his Irish Rhapsodies. Having read these lectures for myself, I really don't see anything truly controversial in them, but I've also read a lot of hotter takes on music that have been written since then. I can see where some of his points could be misunderstood, but things like calling for orchestral concerts of all British composers wasn't chauvinist. It's more about getting their music on the same level as the all-Germanic or all-French concerts that were produced with some regularity. When he talked about brainless singers and the lack of quality British conductors, yeah, that was a worse look, much more controversial in the press, but whatever Elgar added when they were delivered was not captured in this volume either. Anyway, back to Stanford for a minute. Hubert Parry, writing in 1904, said that Stanford had first brought Elgar's music to his attention. But whatever Stanford liked in Elgar did not last. In late 1916, Stanford and his pupil Cecil Forsyth published a history of music that tore Elgar a new one, painting him as someone who was merely lucky that his personal circumstances allowed him to harvest the fruits of others' labor. While Stanford's music is less known today, he was in the academic world and thus was in a position to train much of the next generation. But in some respects, these two enemies were more alike than they were different. Stanford's 1906 Stabat Mater is structurally similar to Elgar's The Black Knight. As John F. Port wrote in 1921, the creative spirit of Stanford, in its maturity, has much that is akin to Elgar. There is the same loftiness of purpose, the deep sense of the beautiful, the desire for self-expression, etc. Alice Elgar died in April 1920, and though Edward would have some years left to him, this brought his career, inaugurated and nurtured by their marriage, to a close. Well, that's not quite true. The idea of someone who heard symphonies among the birds and spoke of music written on the clouds just quitting music wholesale is absurd. He was emotionally broken after Alice's death, but he could be lured out of retirement if you put him in the right environment. He also worked on arrangements for recording sessions. It took about a decade for him to emotionally recover, at which point he only had a few years left. His friend Bernard Shaw convinced the BBC to commission a third symphony. A knight, and at that point master of the king's music, was, it seemed, assumed to be wealthy, but his finances were so poor that his desire to write that elusive third symphony was spurred on, in part because he needed the cash. The third would be one of a number of large-scale works left at various stages of sketching when he died in February 1934 of cancer in his gut. He'd been planning an opera, entertained finishing that oratorio trilogy, even considered a piano concerto. One wonders what Elgar would have produced if he'd prioritized different things at different times in his life, or if he just lived in a time when going to therapy was normalized, so he could have gotten some sort of help for the depression that took hold of his life for a whole decade. The third symphony seemed to be complete, but in pieces and in his head. It wasn't until 1998, when Anthony Payne's painstaking completion was completed, that the piece was heard in any form. Even during his lifetime, but especially afterwards, Elgar was seen as an embodiment of the Edwardian era, a golden Gilded Age hurtling towards the calamity of the Great War. In the aftermath of that war, it's easy to think back on the prior era and recognize it for its failures and its shortcomings. As that era faded further back, rose-colored with nostalgia and then lost to living memory entirely, Elgar's music lost whatever distasteful associations that had once driven audiences away, but retained its essential character. By the 1960s, the Elgar revival had begun in England, but only by suppressing the importance of pieces with problematic ties to colonialism and empire building, stuff like the Coronation Ode or the balance beam he had to walk in Caractacus, which presented the heroic early British as resisting Roman colonization, written when the British Empire was doing a heck of a lot of colonizing themselves. Here was a composer who bared his soul, but was still hard to read. Someone whose multifaceted personality shines in every phrase, stuck at one of the critical junctures of the history of his culture's music. He was willing to take his codes and secrets with him into death, leaving audiences wondering about the enigma, the soul of the violin concerto, or even the surface-level stuff like the nature of the litany of self-quotation in his setting of The Music Makers. The story of Elgar is not just a reminder that you shouldn't give up on your dreams, but a reminder not to let the few negative voices get you down. I won't pretend that Elgar's self-doubt isn't something that most, if not all, creative people have faced and can relate to, but this is a guy who never had a formal lesson, who worked his way up against the tides of English classism, who reshaped the music of his society, who was freaking knighted, and he was still self-conscious. Elgar's story speaks to both the persistence of self-doubt and what can be accomplished despite it.
There is music in the air. The world is full of it, and you simply take as much as you require. Well, many thanks for sitting around for all that. I even think that I learned a few things myself. If you enjoyed the show and you would like to support further music education on, on the YouTube, then please consider becoming a patron of the show or simply leaving a tip. You don't happen to have any Earl Grey around here, do you?
Oh, sure.
Oh, wonderful.
I'll get it for you.